Welcome to Future Energy Insights, the podcast series that explores the future of sustainable innovation, brought to you by the World Future Energy Summit. In this episode, we'll explore how grid-scale storage is revolutionising clean energy, particularly as large-scale PV systems rapidly increase. We'll ask if new storage systems are accelerating the transition to a low-carbon future, look at advancements in battery technology, and explore Abu Dhabi's plans as it drives towards a net zero future. I'm Rob Jones, partner at B2B Connect, and joining me for this episode is Bruce Smith, Executive Director, Strategy and Planning at Emirates Water and Electricity Company. So let's see where the conversation takes us. Bruce, thank you for joining us. Let's start with a scene setter question. So what role does energy storage play in enhancing grid flexibility and resilience, especially when there's high penetration of renewable energy?
Well, it really depends, Rob, on the characteristics of the storage. And it's really important that when we are putting storage into the system, that we specify it and design it in a way that it can provide those ancillary services, that grid support that you're talking to. So and that comes down to the design of the power electronics that sits on the back end of the storage. So if you combine what's called a grid forming inverter, that can actually provide grid stability as part of the energy injection that the storage is providing into the system. So the characteristics of that power electronics is really important in terms of ensuring that we can provide that grid stability that's going to be required. We are actively exploring the potential for using pumped hydro, and Dubai is in the process, obviously, of building some pumped hydro at Hatta. But of course, that water, it either needs to be seawater, which presents its own problems from a corrosion perspective, or it needs to be desalinated water, and then you need to replenish that as it evaporates. But the alternatives to hydro, the battery is the cheapest form of energy storage today. Green hydrogen is actually an energy storage vector. Today, I mean, we use gas as an energy storage. Normal natural gas is a form of energy storage. We could replace natural gas with hydrogen and burn that hydrogen at times when the sun's not shining or the wind's not burning. There's kinetic storage. I mean, there's been a lot of exploration of the potential for using off-peak energy, if you like, to store energy by lifting masses and then dropping it. Compressed air storage is another potential option in this region. I probably missed some out, but those are the primary two. And of course, there are different chemistries on the battery side, which have different durations available to them. I mean, in the UAE, we have an incredible solar resource. I mean, it's dependable most days of the year. We don't get those multiple days of still conditions with a heavy cloud cover that Central Europe would get. So Germany in its Dunkelflaut, where there's no wind because an anticyclone sitting over Central Europe, and there's no wind, and then there's obviously no solar because the cloud cover. That doesn't happen here in the UAE. So solar resources are much more reliable, and we don't get those multiple days where we would need the long duration storage to see us through. So we expect that we could get close around about 98% reliability from a relatively lean, by which I mean not oversized from a battery storage perspective. We could get to around about 98% reliability from a combination of solar and batteries, and it'd still be relatively cost effective. By relatively cost effective, what I mean there is it's going to be cheaper than a gas-fired CCGT plant. That tipping point has already happened.
Give us some insight how storage changing the energy landscape when it's coupled with PV, I guess, in Abu Dhabi.
Sure. Well, I've been managing the production of Abu Dhabi's annual planning statement now for this is the 11th year. So 2015 was the first year that I oversaw that. And there have been three fundamental changes. The first was RO becoming the cheapest, or being identified as being the cheapest water desalination technology. And that was important because we need to separate water production from power production. Why? Because if we have to burn gas to produce water, it means we can't introduce solar or nuclear. In other words, we can't decarbonize the power supply if we're dependent on burning gas in order to produce water. That is well advanced. So we will have gone from 85, 90% thermal desalination in 2019 to 90% membrane-based, i.e. electricity-powered water desalination by 2029. So in 10 years, we'll have just turned on its head the water production from thermal gas-based desalination to electricity-based desalination. And that electricity can be sourced from clean energy. Now, the price that's being offered for a combination of solar plus batteries there to provide this 1 gigawatt of firm supply is now directly cost competitive, not just with gas-fired generation, but with the previously cheapest alternative, which was solar for the day, gas-fired capacity at night. What we're now seeing is solar in the day combined with batteries at night is now directly cost competitive with solar plus gas. And that means that we can push ahead with replacing gas capacity that was previously needed from a least cost perspective at night to a system that could decarbonize at no cost premium. And of course, storage costs are continuing to decline. And I think we need to talk about the difference between cost and price, because battery prices are coming down. It may well be that the cost of those batteries is lower than the price that we're being offered. But of course, we're subject to market forces. But what we're seeing now is, that tipping point has occurred, and solar plus batteries is now the cheapest source of firm capacity moving forward. And there are very few places in the world where that's the case.
So in terms of capacities, where is Abu Dhabi up to, and what are the plans?
Okay, so we've got 2.5 gigawatts of solar capacity that's operational today, but there are another 3 projects in the pipeline. That's another 4.5 gigawatts, which would take the total up to 7 gigawatts by 2028, with a further 3 gigawatts to follow in 2029. So by the end of this decade, we would expect to have 10 gigawatts of solar PV capacity operational, before considering the 4 gigawatts or so of solar PV and 20 gigawatt hours of battery capacity that's been added to serve the AI data center load. So we're accelerating very quickly in terms of solar rollout, and many of those projects are in the pipeline, so to speak, today for delivery from next year onwards, 2026 onwards. We'll see 2026, 27, 28, 2029. Successive additions of new solar capacity into the system.
And in terms of battery energy storage, how much is planned there, and where will it be located?
Increasing progressive growth in demand is happening, and on top of that, the desire to decarbonize is driving an increase in the amount of final demand that needs to be served by the grid. So today we're seeing something like 20 to 25% of final energy demand served from the grid. It's estimated by the IEA that by 2050, we would need to see that, or that figure of 20 to 25% would need to increase to closer to 60 to 65%. So we've got 2.5 times more final energy demand that will need to be served from the grid. All of that's driving a dramatic increase in the amount of solar capacity that we're going to need to install. So we estimate at the moment that for Abu Dhabi to reach net zero on a least cost basis, we would need to build something like 85 gigawatts. That's for EWEX demand, so Abu Dhabi in the Northern Emirates. That recognizes the efficiency of today's solar capacity. That's around 22-23%. If we get new technologies emerging that increase that efficiency, and that's highly likely, then obviously that land requirement comes down. But it is a big land requirement. If that land's not available, then what's the alternative to get us to net zero? We have limited wind resources in the Emirates, and the land requirement to produce a significant amount of wind energy is typically 10 times more than the land requirement to produce the same energy from solar. So we've got a poor wind resource, and we've got a challenge in terms of land area. So wind probably isn't a practical proposition for providing very much. And the other factor, of course, if you're comparing it with solar, it's typically significantly more expensive. At today's prices in Abu Dhabi, we're estimating around double, potentially triple the cost of solar. So wind is not likely to play a major role. Geothermal has been talked about. There's limited geothermal resource. It could contribute, but it's unlikely to be a major source. So nuclear really, at the moment, is the most plausible alternative. And we've looked at the cost of achieving net zero following a nuclear-based pathway versus a solar-based pathway. Now, we've not prohibited solar in the nuclear pathway. We're assuming that we would still have 20 gigawatts of solar by 2050, but we've cut it at 20 gigawatts. And our cost indications today are that the unit cost in 2050, having at net zero, will be 45% lower using a solar-based pathway compared with a nuclear-based pathway. And that's recognizing that we would still need to add in carbon capture and storage and potentially some green hydrogen to get us in that last 2 or 3% of the way towards that final more costly last few percentage points. If you imagine the Nike swoosh and you're tracking down in terms of costs falling down the slow part of the Nike swoosh, and then you've got an uptick at the end towards 2050, where getting to full decarbonised net zero is actually going to be quite tricky.
But achievable, possible.
It's definitely achievable. Are we going to be prepared to pay the cost premium for it? And we've identified what the cost associated with doing that looks like. But the UAE has a tremendous competitive advantage in terms of decarbonising for the next 15 years or so, where we see the unit cost of energy supplied to customers falling over that period as a consequence of introducing solar plus batteries, even at today's prices. And that's driven by access to cheap capital, a very strong and reliable solar resource, and undeveloped land. So we're making an assumption that land can be made available. And of course, there's the support for decarbonising, which is so critical to enable this to happen.
And just turning back to the batteries, or battery energy storage. So within the picture you've painted, what role will battery storage play?
Batteries will be absolutely essential to managing those hours of the day when solar energy is not directly available as the primary energy source. Now, our original perspective was that gas would fill in at night. I mean, we have the gas capacity available today. In 2019, gas was providing 99-point-something% of the total energy. And it was the primary energy source that we were using to produce all of our energy, to all intents and purposes, in 2019. By 2029, we could be in the situation facilitated by the transition to RO and decoupling of water production from power production. But by 2029, we could be in a position where we could serve that first hour of demand in the winter period when the demand is relatively lower, solely from solar plus nuclear. So we can have that first, what I call zero hour in terms of gas burn.
So at the World Future Energy Summit in the past, we've talked about gas being the bridging fuel. Mean that effectively battery energy storage is going to become the bridging technology in that energy transition?
I think gas will continue to be a critical enabler of the transition. I don't think there's any way around that. And I think from a system resilience perspective as well, what happens if you do get those 2 or 3 days of consecutive cloudy weather? We will not have the spare surplus storage capacity installed that will enable us to get through those periods. So gas is going to be indispensable in terms of providing the system security, system resilience, well into the 2040s. And I think as technologies develop, as the potential for long duration battery storage emerges, the decision about exactly how we will eliminate those last hours of gas-fired supply on the system will become clearer. we don't need to commit today to what that answer looks like. The challenge we face now is simply building out the battery storage that will enable us to deploy solar energy that's produced during the day at night for the majority of days of the year. So that's the initial challenge, and that's a scale challenge. I mean, today's system in Abu Dhabi is around about 100 terawatt hours. So if you say that the average number of daylight hours is in this region, we're just about on the Tropic of Cancer, is around just over 11 hours a day. Well, that means that for just around 13 hours of the day, we are going to need to source energy from somewhere else. Now, if that energy comes from solar, it needs to be stored in batteries. And at the moment, it's coming from gas and some nuclear.
And where is Abu Dhabi up to in terms of projects to put in these systems, the battery energy storage systems?
Up until this year, and this year's planning statement, as I just alluded to, this year's planning cycle identified that for the very first time, we've hit that tipping point where introducing large amounts of battery rather than depending on gas overnight actually makes economic sense. What we were recommending up until that point, where we've hit that tipping point, was that we build lots of solar to substitute for gas that was previously running during the daytime, and then we use gas at night. Now we've hit that tipping point for battery storage being cheaper than the gas supply at night. It will be a case of building out battery storage in conjunction with that solar PV for all projects.
Okay, and a layman question. How much space are we talking when you start adding the battery capacity required?
So the space for the battery component is a relatively minor part of the overall requirement when we're talking about less than 5% of the total. But the space required for the solar element is anything but. And to give some perspective on this, if the UAE is going to go down a net zero pathway based on solar, and we're going for this 150 gigawatts by 2050, the majority of that's going to need to be we can't develop much before 2029. So new capacity enters now from 2030 onwards. So between 2030 and 2050, we need to go from current installed capacity of around, let's say we're up around 10 gigawatts by 2030. That means that we need 140 gigawatts installed over a 20-year period. And we could do it if we treat it as a portfolio. And if we said, okay, by 2050, we need to be here. We need 150 gigawatts. What do we need to do in order to get there? It would be about identifying the land, identifying the transmission corridors, and working backwards to put in place the procurement programs, the procurement models. Maybe it's going to be advisable to do in-country manufacturing to limit supply chain risks and so on. But procuring the next 1.5 gigawatts and then the next 1.5 gigawatts and so on, that which is the model we followed to date, that will not get us where we need to go to. We need to be thinking about what is the program that we need to be able to implement and how can we achieve the desired outcomes. We need to think strategically, where do we want to be in 2050 and work backwards from there. I think the advantage that we have here is one of cost. Going down this pathway is a no regrets from cost perspective, not just no regrets. It provides a tremendous economic enabler and advantage.
Once you get to periods such as the winter, does that mean that you have excess capacity stored in the batteries that can be used for something else?
The reality is we're sitting here in an air-conditioned auditorium, but it's 40-odd degrees outside. The energy demand in July and August in the UAE is typically double what it would be in January and February. So we have to build enough capacity to serve the demand at the peak period of the year. So typically on our system, we've got load factors of around 57%. What that means is that you build capacity to meet the peak, but you only use 57% of that over the course of the year on average. Now, there is the opportunity for that energy that is being produced and is being stored, but isn't being required just to serve existing demand, to flatten that profile maybe, where if we've got industries or demand that can take advantage of that surplus that's available at times of the year when the demand is lower.
I mean, I was thinking you have obviously some of the heavy industries are looking to electrification. You also have big ambitions around this country.
Green hydrogen, Robson, is a topic for another day, I think. But the reality is that the economics of green hydrogen today are challenging. And you minimize the cost of producing green hydrogen by maximizing the utilization of those electrolyzers that you are trying to turn water into, or split water into hydrogen. And if you are only using those electrolyzers at certain times of the year or of the day, then you have invested a lot in the capital cost of that infrastructure, and you don't get the lowest possible cost of hydrogen. So the net result would be that your green hydrogen is more expensive. So the energy is just one component in the final cost of your green hydrogen. So don't really see hydrogen as likely to be a natural consumer of this surplus. But there may be other industries where there would be some flexibility in terms of how they could consume, and that could be to their advantage.
Okay, so I think we've explored a lot around what's happening, where this is going. Are there any technical barriers?
For most people who are not close to the technical challenges of what we're trying to do, the problem is just building enough. And if you build the batteries and you build the solar and the wind, then the problem's solved. But actually, from a grid operator's perspective, the system stability services that have traditionally been provided by large rotating masses that are part of a gas plant or a coal plant or a nuclear plant are increasingly not present. And what we saw in Spain and Portugal recently is an outage of a nuclear plant, low operation or a low amount of physical inertia provided to them, inertia provided by the gas capacity. There wasn't much gas capacity operating. And the system was unable to respond to changes in voltage and changes in frequency, and they had a problem. So I think the real challenge that we face is not just building all of the solar and battery capacity, but then making sure that we can operate it securely.
Talking about other industries working in parallel to improve, to make sure that this all slots together.
Other industries, could include demand response in terms of balancing supply and demand. But fundamentally, the power system is one of the most complicated machines that mankind has ever developed. It's this huge mesh that connects demand across large geographical areas. And we need to maintain a frequency within very narrow limits. Voltage needs to be managed. The change in supply and demand needs to be balanced from 1 second to the next. And the control systems to do that will need to be more sophisticated than certainly we've got available today. And yet what we're doing is moving from a system which was gas-fired to one that we could be having no gas running in as little as 4 years' time. So control systems are going to be a key enabler to this energy transition and driving down the unit cost of energy.
Okay, and just a final question. You touched on bankability. You said that battery storage had now reached a tipping point when coupled with PV. So again, assumption is that this is going to accelerate. And I'm guessing now we'll see a lot more PV projects, not just in Abu Dhabi, but everywhere, that now couple battery and PV together, because suddenly it's just what investors expect.
Yeah, the procurement models that we have used to date will need to be adapted and evolved to allow us to procure at a scale that we haven't done till today. And a 1.5 gigawatts project is enormous. Particularly if you try and envisage that, we're talking about an area of about 15 square kilometers. That's Abu Dhabi Island, covered in solar panels for one project. And we're talking about doing 3 or 4 projects every year and coupling that with batteries. And that needs to be done year on, year out for 20 odd years. So the procurement model needs to recognize that, the scale that we are looking to develop this is very different. So the number of players who can participate on that will necessarily be limited because of the physical value of those projects and the scale at which we're going to need to deploy. Bankability of the technology itself, I think, is pretty well proven. how we structure those procurement deals, I think there's plenty of room for further iteration and evolution there. It's new. I mean, the first battery project was procured by Abu Dhabi. That was only this year. Contract's not yet been awarded, but we've received the bids. That was 400 megawatts times 2 hours. We're now looking at a 19 gigawatt hour project for the AI data center lid. And then we're looking at doing maybe double every year.
Obviously, we're talking a lot about AI-ready data centers now, but also we're talking a lot about the use of AI, and that consumes significantly more energy than current systems or previous systems. Has that been difficult to predict or to plan for in terms of how that will change energy requirements?
Yeah, I mean, when a new customer comes along and said, we would like a 5 gigawatt supply, please, within the next 4 years, of course it's challenging. And I think Abu Dhabi is one of the very few places in the world where we could realistically entertain the prospects of meeting such a demand within such a timescale. If you go in most places in the US or in Europe, it's not possible. It's just not possible. But the single buyer model that we've got in Abu Dhabi allows for a centralized approach to planning at a system level. I mean, we're not planning a supply to serve AI data center. We're planning to supply a system where the demand is increased by the 5 gigawatts that the AI data center is requesting. So we're going up from a 22 gigawatt system to a 27 gigawatt peak demand system. That's significantly easier and more secure than trying to plan a dedicated captive supply, if you like, that's supposed to meet all of the security requirements that an AI data center demands. So the AI data center will enjoy the overall security limits that the grid provides, and by being part of an overall system that we're planning. So I think there's a real benefit from this centralized approach to planning. From thousands and thousands of potentially connected loads or supplies is something that's not possible with today's control systems, but could become possible and then be enabled by the application of AI to a fully integrated system of systems that was operating, that we're going to need to develop.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. This has been a Future Energy Insights podcast for the World Future Energy Summit.